Christ, hallelujah.
On July 20th, 2015, a wooden altar made during French colonial times was returned to the Mi'kmaq people of Potlotek First Nation. It was a historic day, one that captivated the hearts of hundreds of people who attended the celebration. It is important to know we, the Mi'kmaq, are connected to the land we call Mi'kmaqi and have been for over 11,000 years. One of our greatest archaeological sites is in Turbulent, Nova Scotia. We call it Potlotek and is one of the oldest known and best recorded Paleo-Indian sites in North America. There is no area we do not know in our homeland. We traveled, hunted, and lived in every corner. Our attachments to Mi'kmaqi and to its beings are embedded in our place names, stories, language, governance systems, dance, and our relationships to one another. When French explorers first came to Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq helped them survive and do well. We assisted them and we became strong allies. History tells us that even before Port Royal was settled in Nova Scotia, our ancestors encountered mariners of Basque, Portuguese, Spanish, English, and French descent. Nicolas Denny, an early French explorer, documented years of peaceful coexistence with the Mi'kmaq during his time in St. Peter's, Port Toulouse. In 1610, it was at Port Royal, in what then was called Acadie by the French, that Grand Chief Membertou and 20 of his people were baptized into the Catholic faith. Grand Chief Membertou was the first Mi'kmaq to be baptized, which encouraged others of our nation to embrace the Catholic religion. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed by the French and British governments, and it divided up our homeland without our ancestors' consent. The British were given mainland Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. The French received Prince Edward Island and Cape Breton Island. Immediately, the French established Louisbourg and Port Toulouse on Cape Breton, our Unama'ki. Port Toulouse was nestled in between the two sites of Mi'kmaq villages, one near the Atlantic Ocean and the other on the Bedore Lakes, and a Nuigan portage joined the two bodies of water. The French documented that the Mi'kmaq attended Mass at Port Toulouse, both inside the fort and later at a chapel built outside the fort. During the same period, there was a chapel at Malagawaj. It was a mission where a priest who was dedicated to serving the Mi'kmaq lived. Over time, the site became less suitable for the Mi'kmaq, as the chapel at Malagawaj fell into ruins. The Mi'kmaq proposed to move the mission to our traditional meeting place at Chapel Island, which the French called Ile de la Sainte-Famille. The most renowned missionary to the Mi'kmaq at Chapel Island was Father Maillard. It was he who pressed the French government to build a church at Chapel Island. In 1742, Maillard gave his first sermon on the island from a boulder that is still there. Father Maillard would become the longest-serving missionary among the Mi'kmaq. He quickly learned the language and produced a hieroglyphic prayer book that was used as an aid to teach religion to our ancestors. Maillard was an interpreter for the Mi'kmaq and the French. In 1745, an army from New England captured Louisbourg and the French mission at Chapel Island came to an end. Father Maillard was taken prisoner and transported to Boston, then to France. Under the leadership of the Grand Council and prayer leaders, the Catholic religious faith was still practiced among the Mi'kmaq. Following a treaty in 1748, which handed Cape Breton back to the French returned to Louisbourg and Father Maillard to the Mi'kmaq on Chapel Island in 1749. He continued his work. In the early 1750s, Father Maillard built the first church using his own money and was later reimbursed. When Louisbourg fell to the British a second time in 1758, it was the end of an era. The French were rounded up and transported to France. Father Maillard left Chapel Island and continued to serve the Mi'kmaq, this time on behalf of the British, from their base in Halifax. The church at Chapel Island was burned to the ground, along with the priest's house. The previous church, along with the glebe house, burned down in 1976 when it was struck by lightning. The present church stands as the latest in a series of churches dating back 250 years. Where does the old French altar, which was recently returned to Chapel Island, come from? There are several possibilities. It might come from France itself, from nearby Port Toulouse, or maybe even from the fortress of Louisbourg. The particular details matter less than the fact that the altar was saved because it was taken away and hidden by our ancestors before it could be destroyed. Our oral traditions make it clear. Our ancestors saved this altar and hid it away. Oral history from our Mi'kmaq elders tells us that the altar was taken from Port Toulouse during times of conflict.
Oh, the elders I interviewed back in 1999 were my mother, Mrs. Anatina Marshall, and she told me what her husband, Noel Marshall, said about the altar. Mrs. Caroline Gould of Waikagma, formerly at Potlotek, and she told me what her and her husband said about the altar. Mrs. Margaret Johnson of Eskisoni, formerly at Potlotek. Anthony Marshall, member 2, formerly at Potlotek. Mrs. Mary Gould, member 2, formerly at Potlotek. And Wilfred Prosper, formerly at Potlotek. And the last one is Mrs. Annie Isabel Johnson from Eskisoni. And they basically told me the same thing, that it was just on loan. It was supposed to be brought back when the church was finished. And the other one was for safekeeping, to protect it from, because the church wasn't heated. And all of them said it was just there temporarily. And that's all.
I heard about it from my father, because he used to talk about it, and Mom, and all that. And I heard one time he tried to go and get it, and with somebody else. I don't know who it was, but I heard he did that. I know the name, but I forget it. But they weren't successful anyway. They didn't get it. So I don't know if anybody ever tried after and all that, but I don't know. But I heard about it through the years, all these years. I'm 78, and I've heard about it for over 60 years maybe, or 70 years, because I heard about it a long time ago.
Geez, I've been hearing about the altar since I was a kid, so it goes back a long way. I didn't think it existed. I just thought it was I don't know, like a myth or something. Didn't think it was there, you know? That's what it is, really.
Patkwi-Alasutmaqn, Eden, Johnstown.
Sarajish.
Sarajish. Kutjak is na Mergisar.
Makamunutja. Megajo.
Megajigawa.
Pas mgidu nanti dia ni Messi mgidu. Tam sarau ye ni widain ko.
Sana nadam pas ma resperidam mo. Sa kis kanwa keji duwa ko ba aitin mingwara siga chansa wirwatin kanina mo nemi duwa. Silya na nemi duwa di ba hala eldaji kanina nemi duwa na ne pas mo sa aiwa. Masma almesi che non tu quella, non ha detto una a già che mi capi, perché
Inu di maya Patkwi-Alasutmaqn hanadimiya. Eduka
5-6 years ago.
5-6 years ago. Ima widayek she pastoral council iliani ignu aduk siagaba. Ede Patkwi-Alasutmaqn Johnstown to get to do a duty.
Ima widayegab Amsterdam al age badly aska al nuega deal
Una diocese.
Cape Breton na age Pictou a age Bakenkik.
Migma pastoral council. Inas piega fivienen. And iliani yanganut she Patkwi-Alasutmaqn. Menuega babon muksina dan liabajatua.
Yeah, approach you out of Negam Council at that time. Well, now, everything before, because you do us that edict, such a thing that belonged to Potlotek or
Dame
whatever.
hoje on it.
Mini Kuga, do what you are.
Maligo hoje, kado?
Mugaji do history.
Maligoyes kujia.
Maligo hoje, kado mugudel, mina dago sitna. Mikian dulio guys, we do net. Maligo hoje, kujia Eric Johnstown.
Dear.
Yeah.
Nu da kom det skulle nu nu tror jag alltid på jag var skåd med det var tvärsman. Kan na kanske då. Liksom na sig så då att han twitch jag att du så. Kan det kanske då är det chanstan kall. Aj att tvärsman men det går.
Well, I've always known about the altar ever since I was a child. It was a very, very special altar for us because every 12th of the month would go down and say the rosary, and I'd go down with my mother. As far as knowing the history of the altar, it was the late 90s when I really became aware of the importance and all the history of the altar for the Mi'kmaq people.
Well, I first heard about the altar through Chief Wilbur and the bishop. And at that time, the altar was still in the other church. And it was a matter of negotiating how do we successfully move it, get it released from there so it could be returned to St. Anne's. So that was the first time I'd heard about it. And I hadn't seen it until it actually was on the island.
Well, did be kisi dasig ni. Kuri abjasig me na de go sa tai ne king manai. Tam boktam kia tai ne da. Hala me sigam pai ne minigo. Indel ne minna connection ni abjasi. Hala du na de go ya. Hala du ni dai na de go mude ya. Gisamat no dan du ji boktam kia la. Also do go mal ni snu wa hal ni. Ase tan original law. Sachuanuwa ma kada all dead ni awal chiu ya ne mi du na ne na de go sa awi me survive me.
The Mi'kmaq moved it by hiding the altar in the woods. The altar may have been later transported to Mulligawaj and later to Chapel Island. Since there was no resident priest for over 100 years, the elders and history tells us that the St. Anne's mission continued even though a permanent priest was not available. The Mi'kmaq Grand Council kept and maintained the Christian faith for over a century. Their duties included conducting marriages, burials, and baptisms. They would read from the Mi'kmaq hieroglyphic prayer book and were available to the Mi'kmaq people when they prayed.
Net nou laat lezen, mobilian op zo'n klavier, nu mij op middelian. Klaman kiesvo, tel dat ik naam had naar mij.
The Grand Council district chiefs came from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Quebec, and Newfoundland. The role of the Grand Council was significant in keeping the Chapel Island mission running, as well as keeping the Christian faith among the Mi'kmaq.
My father was in the Grand Council, and I heard a lot about the Grand Council in my lifetime. But before I heard that our ancestors had a system of government which consisted of the political, education, economic, social and spiritual systems. We are a branch of the Wabanaki tribes. We are one of them. The others are Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Abenaki, and Malsits. And we are known as Wishkabaniakawa, or People of the Dawn. And we formed a confederacy called the Wabanaki Confederacy. The Mi'kmaq divided their territory into 7 fishing and hunting territories. And the other tribes respected our territory. We formed a confederacy, and the Grand Council represented us at their annual meetings, which were held in Mi'kmaq and in the rest of the area, which was New England states, where the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy lives. So those were our districts back then.
Between 1812 and 1813, construction begins on a new chapel on Minigoak. Where the altar was located during that time lapse is still a mystery. It isn't until 1876 that it reappears, and we know it is moved from Chapel Island, Minigoak, to Red Islands under Father McDougall's jurisdiction. It would stay in the Johnstown parish for almost 100 years, where it would miss the fire of 1976. When construction began on the new church in Chapel Island, several attempts to have the altar returned back to Minigoak were made. It became evident that any attempts to return the altar to Chapel Island would be met with denial. In 1999, a new chapel, St. Kateri Tekakwitha, was built onto the Potlotek Community Hall. Prior to that, former Chief Newell Tissett and the Potlotek Prayer Group attempted to have the altar returned to the community of Chapel Island in hopes that it would be placed in the newly built chapel. Unfortunately, those requests were also denied.
First heard about the altar, I'd say I was about 11 or 12, the time the church burnt down the island. Because we lost a lot more stuff in the church at that time. But the altar was not there, so obviously we didn't lose the altar. And there's talk then about when we rebuild the church on the island, perhaps we could get the altar back then. So that was back maybe 77, 78. No, it's something plus the altar is something you heard about all growing up.
In 2015, many Catholic churches were closing in the surrounding area of Potlotek, mainly due to inattendance and a shortage of priests. Elder and historian Lillian B. Marshall shared her knowledge and history about the French altar with Sakama Wilbert Marshall. Having the altar returned to Potlotek and to the Mi'kmaq people would continue to renew our strong Catholic faith and connection to our ancestors in traditional ways. This conversation sparked and resurrected efforts to bring the altar back to its rightful place.
Chief Marshall wrote a letter, and as part of my work, I supported getting his letter completed and presented to the Assembly, expressing the concern over the delay in returning the altar to Potlotek. And so the Assembly heard about the issue and passed by resolution support as a nation for the move of the altar back home. And the Assembly supported Chief Marshall's letter. And so the letter went out to the bishop. And as a result of that letter from Chief Marshall, things started to move again.
Chief Wilbert Marshall, with community members, tried on their own to negotiate the return of the altar with Johnstown parishioners, but efforts were unsuccessful. In March of 2015, a formal request from the Nova Scotia Assembly of Chiefs was made to the Diocese of Antigonish to have the altar returned.
And then we started having meetings, and we said, we're going to try and get it back by meeting with the people again. But we didn't. We just wrote to the chief, got involved, and we wrote to the 13 chiefs in Nova Scotia, the Parks Canada, and the bishop. And the bishop agreed this time that we could have the altar back. And we waited for the answer from the bishop. And as soon as we got word, we went to get the altar. But before we did, we had to send it to the experts in Lewisburg, where they took it apart and checked it and cleaned it a little bit. And then we had to bring it back to the island in June of this year.
In the same month, the busload of Potlotek community members, media, and parishioners met at the Sacred Hearts Parish Church in Johnstown. It was then that archaeologist Heather McLeod Leslie, with Gwilamug Mau Gluzawagan Mi'kmaq Rights Initiative, assessed the altar structure and determined that it could be moved without damage.
Well, it's an amazing piece. Its history and the life of the altar is, in many respects, written within the body of it, in the different kinds of nails that are used, in the layers of paint and the different ways that the wood is fitted together and then refitted together, the way the altar stone is laid within it. So what I did determine was that there were some areas of the wood that were weaker than others, but really we identified some of the challenges in removing it, that it was attached to the wall of the church physically, that it was nailed and not screwed. So the rigors of getting it physically off of the church could potentially cause it some stress. Also, that the altar was comprised of a number of different pieces, some of which, from the top of it, the altar risers that flanked the tabernacle, and then the altar canopy, where the icon had been later placed within it, were all separable. So in that respect, those smaller pieces could be moved in and of themselves, but then the altar base would present some challenges.
On June 24, 2015, after many discussions with both Potlotek and Johnstown parishioners, Bishop Brian Dunn agreed to have the altar returned. Once approval to have the altar was granted, things started to move quickly. Parks Canada representatives removed the altar from its Johnstown resting place and brought it back to the fortress of Lewisburg, where it was cleaned and restored. On July 20, 2015, the historic French altar was placed back on the shores of Chapel Island. Gray skies didn't dampen the spirits of hundreds who traveled to await the altar's arrival. Sakamak from around Unamagi, community members, both men and women, paddled canoes alongside the Anitina barge, from the Potlotek shore to the Chapel Island shore. Upon arrival, the altar was met by the Mi'kmaq Grand Council members. It was on the shore that a traditional Mi'kmaq welcoming ceremony was conducted, and our Mi'kmaq people welcomed back the beloved French altar. It was a day for celebration. The altar was carried on the shoulders and backs of the newly appointed altar keepers. Community members carried the smaller pieces in procession. And as the men stepped into St. Dan's Church, the altar was met with the familiar sound of the chapel church bells. A procession of over 100 escorted the altar into the church, as our Mi'kmaq Women's Drum Group, Mi'kmaq Choir, and community sang the Mi'kmaq Honor Song. Because of our elders and the tradition of sharing our history through storytelling, we Mi'kmaq wrote another part of history, one that will be shared for generations with our children. as a result of our elders' stories, oral history, and cultural Mi'kmaq traditions. Our rich past continues to live on for our children to hear. Thanks to our elders, the words and stories shared of the French altar, its beginnings and its significant relationship to the Mi'kmaq has been kept, preserved, and passed on. If it wasn't for our elders and the Johnstown parishioners who kept it safe for so many years, the story of the altar would have been forgotten about.
Espiado sit.
Standing in. Standing in for Rome's holy men, these men stood and kept the faith, strong as the pillars of Peter's church, standing behind the Patkwi-Alasutmaqn. 1745, the French of Louisbourg at war. 1754, the altar hides among the Mi'kmaq. 1758, the church is raised with fire. The men of spirit and conviction, reading from sacred Mi'kmaq texts, standing behind the altar, share the word of God, teach the hungry souls till 1890, when it left the Ile de Famille to a place named Johnstown, the home of the lone Roman priest, remain until today, 20th of July 2015. The circle closes and a new day begins when the men of spirit and conviction stand together again like old friends, long parted and reunited inside the house of God.